After the 2022 midterms, Ron DeSantis had a pretty bright future in the Republican Party. He had won re-election by a historic margin in the state of Florida and led Republicans to supermajorities in both chambers there. And this was all while Republicans across the country, many of whom were Trump-endorsed candidates, were floundering, and many of those candidates lost their elections. But Florida was really a bright beacon of hope for the GOP. While they had failed in other parts of the country, Florida had gotten significantly redder. So Ron DeSantis really was the heir apparent. And for many Republican voters, if Trump was out of the picture in 2024, he would be cruising to the Republican nomination right now. But that's not what's happening. Ron DeSantis' campaign has really failed to make significant traction since its launch in May. And really a lot of Ron DeSantis' momentum was right after this midterm victory. This is when he started to soar in the polls. This is when he was beating Trump in some national polls. He was winning in statewide polls. That arguably should have been the moment when Ron DeSantis announced for president, because everyone knew at that point that Ron DeSantis was going to run. I mean, he had a record of conservative successes in Florida. Trump had been out of the national picture for 2 years. You have the legal problems he's been going through. His candidates did horrible in the midterm. So it really would have been the best time to create that sort of contrast of competent conservative success with unkept promises and arguably failure. So in today's video, we're going to talk about why Ron DeSantis' campaign is failing and whether or not there's any chance he can recover from this and somehow, by a miracle, win the Republican nomination. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So some people arguably credit Ron DeSantis as one of the singular reasons why Florida is as red as it is. Again, the Florida legislature has a supermajority in both chambers for the Republican Party. Every statewide official in Florida is Republican. That's the first time that's happened since the Civil War. And hundreds of thousands of Republican voters have been attracted to the state since COVID. And you can really trace that back to Ron DeSantis' COVID policies. Florida was one of the first states to reopen, and you had a lot of Republican migrants from blue states that had still been shut down, passing these draconian COVID policies. A lot of people going towards Florida, seeking freedom, a low cost of living, and ultimately a state that shared their conservative values. And Florida really was that beacon for conservatives. And had Ron DeSantis not won the governorship in 2018, things might have been very different for the state of Florida, which really goes to show you, and is probably an extreme example, that elections have consequences. And had a Democrat, had Andrew Gillum won the governorship in Florida, it's very likely that things could have trended a lot differently. But DeSantis won, and his policies were widely popular in the state, hence his just massive margin of victory. A lot of Republicans look to Florida as sort of the GOP poster child. Again, this was a state that was purple on the national level for decades, and now is likely going to be a likely or even safe Republican state in the near future, and potentially even longer due to the demographic makeup of the state. So Ron DeSantis can largely be credited for some of these shifts. Again, hundreds of thousands of blue state Republicans had moved to Florida because of Ron DeSantis' COVID policy. And these are people that do vote. And again, there's other reasons why Florida is red. You have the red shift among Latinos, Cubans getting redder, and perhaps we'll address all that in a separate video. Essentially, Ron DeSantis had the perfect opportunity to contrast himself with Donald Trump. Now, Republicans have obviously had their love affair with Donald Trump since 2015. Since he came down the escalator, he sort of sparked a whole new movement, the MAGA movement, around sort of populist right-wing policies, secure the border, make things in America, promote freedom, things that all conservatives really can get behind. And DeSantis really could have marketed himself as somebody who got Trump's policies done, essentially, in the state of Florida and was more effective at it. DeSantis has obviously shown he's been a competent governor, and that's something he could have run on. And, unfortunately for him, that message really just hasn't been resonating. Republicans still do not want to let Donald Trump go. And some in the DeSantis campaign might decide to blame Republican voters, say they're uninformed, but really it lies on the DeSantis campaign to make the case to Republicans why he's the better option. And really ever since February, you've seen just a stark decline in the polling from nearly 40% down to the teens. It's really quite pathetic, the state at which the DeSantis campaign sees itself in, especially given the fact that there was a time where they were very competitive with Donald Trump. If we take a look at the national polling, Ron DeSantis is at 14% in 270 to win. RCP has DeSantis at 13.7. Donald Trump is beating DeSantis by some 40 points in every single polling aggregate. And this is somebody who's been indicted federally multiple times, someone who arguably is less conservative than Ron DeSantis, and yet he's running away with the nomination. And one of the reasons I think that is because Trump simply has the charisma, he has the vibes that Republicans are looking for. You know, after the Bush years and after Obama, you know, that's 16 years where you sort of had these more populist conservatives, grassroots conservatives sort of held down within the party. And of course, Donald Trump comes along and says everything they want to hear. So really, ever since then, you can't blame these voters for sticking with Donald Trump for so long, because he's so good at framing everything as an attack against him because he's the outsider that's going to shake up the system. And that message has been insanely effective, you know, true or not. And Ron DeSantis just doesn't have as much of a compelling message. Again, he does have a good record in Florida, a really good record in Florida. Constitutional carry, the heartbeat bill, all things that conservatives should be rallying about and excited about, but he's just not really messaging these legislative accomplishments effectively. And, you know, his campaign is really marred with a lot of second guessing itself, changing of strategy, and just muddled messaging altogether. I mean, the campaign has been in a downward spiral really even before it began. Again, Ron DeSantis announced in May, and there was barely a polling bump once he did. He was already in the low 20s by the time he decided to announce. So waiting until after the legislative session honestly was a mistake. And I really think that DeSantis should have harnessed that lightning in a bottle when he had the chance, because he really missed the window. And, you know, looking at this New York Times article, there's really 4 major challenges that DeSantis' campaign is grappling with. And again, this was written in August 10th, but I've read through the article. It's all very relevant to today, even though this article is almost 2 months old. So going through it real quick, Donald Trump is a major problem. DeSantis' messaging around Donald Trump has been a problem. For most of his campaign, he's refused to really say anything critical of Trump, and if he did, it was a very mild jab that, you know, your average person probably wouldn't even pick up on anyway, and quite frankly was just seen as sort of cowardly. I think the first time Ron DeSantis actually criticized Donald Trump by name was during the second debate, which really should have happened from the moment he launched, because everybody knew that Ron DeSantis was running against Trump in the primary, so it was kind of odd that he really didn't want to attack Trump on issues where he objectively would have been seen better among the base. But again, sometimes you really need a good messenger to get the message across, and I think DeSantis is somebody who certainly struggles with that sort of natural charisma. You know, Donald Trump certainly possesses that. You know, he's been a reality TV star host, a prominent businessman in New York City for decades, so he's somebody who obviously has to have really good communication skills, and Ron DeSantis just doesn't have that. You know, he comes off as very forced, in some cases even inauthentic to some people. So when you compare that to somebody like Trump, you know, the vibes are just off. You know, the feeling voters have with these two candidates, Trump just seems as the more authentic candidate, just by his natural charismatic demeanor. So how to talk about Donald Trump is a real issue for DeSantis. Also, his messaging, as I alluded to earlier, was really off. You know, he really tried to hone in on the fact that he's the more electable Republican, when for months he didn't even talk about Donald Trump's election claims going back to 2020. He didn't rebuke them or anything like that. He didn't really try to paint a clear contrast. And I know the vast majority of Republican voters think the 2020 election was stolen. Obviously, DeSantis knows that. Obviously, his strategists know that. But you can't make the electability argument if the majority of Republican voters don't even think the 2020 election was even legitimate. So that's really a major flaw already. You sort of have to tweak your message just right to sort of drive that point home. And admittedly, it's very hard to do, but DeSantis clearly has not done that. Again, he won a swing state by 20 points, basically, back in the midterm elections. Donald Trump only won Florida by around 3 and some change, and of course he won it by around a point in 2016. So he massively overperformed Trump in every single demographic: black, white, Latino, educated, non-educated, every voting demographic. DeSantis did miles better than Donald Trump, and yet he really wasn't able to articulate that because he wasn't able to tailor his message in a way that would have been receptive to a large portion of the Republican base. You also have donors leaving Ron DeSantis slowly over time as he's really been failing to deliver results. Again, 13% polling nationally. It's already October. You know, the Iowa caucuses are in January. Including this month, you really only have 3 months to reverse this. And, you know, a lot of DeSantis supporters and campaign operatives have been looking at various points in the campaign cycle where they think Ron DeSantis is going to get momentum. They talked about once he announces he's going to shoot up, the first debate, the second debate. It hasn't materialized. And now, of course, you have a lot of them saying that Ron DeSantis is going to start skyrocketing in the polls come Iowa. But again, there's really not momentum there. You have to build momentum. And, you know, DeSantis' strategy, admittedly, over the past few weeks has been better, but it at this point really just seems too little too late. And, you know, again, Donald Trump is running away with this despite everything. Despite being indicted multiple times, he's been able to frame that in a positive way to Republicans. DeSantis really hasn't helped in that regard. He's been very supportive of Donald Trump throughout this whole thing and really hasn't made the case that he can do a better job at leading the party than Donald Trump. I mean, basically parroting everything that Donald Trump says is not going to make that point clear. Again, as Kristi always says, in order to win the Republican nomination in 24, you have to run through Trump, not around him. And I think DeSantis, for most of the campaign, has been trying to run around Donald Trump, over, under him. But you have to run directly through him. You have to attack him directly, and you have to go at him on issues that Republicans actually care about. He really hasn't talked much about the gun issue. DeSantis is much more conservative on guns than Donald Trump. Abortion, same thing. And again, abortion's a bit of a dicey one, though, because nationally that's an election loser. Donald Trump actually has a better strategy on abortion and better messaging on abortion than DeSantis does. Especially because, you know, Donald Trump is not a religious person. He doesn't come across as somebody who actually has it in his heart and soul to take away abortion. So, you know, and voters know that. So I think on the abortion issue, Donald Trump's actually the best Republican candidate in terms of electability there. But in the Republican primary, it's a very different story. And yet, despite all of DeSantis' accomplishments, he still hasn't been able to message them effectively on abortion with the evangelical crowd. And you do have some prominent pro-lifers supporting Ron DeSantis, but again, it's really not doing a whole lot for him. And finally, Ron DeSantis has really put all the eggs in the Iowa basket. And, you know, that's something that a lot of other failed presidential campaigns have done. You know, Michael Bloomberg famously, I think, skipped the first 4 states in the Democratic primary to focus on Super Tuesday. That didn't work out for him. This has happened time and time again, and it really is sort of a losing strategy. I mean, it's sort of a last-ditch effort to try and gain a large amount of momentum right at the last minute. But, you know, it really doesn't seem like it's going to materialize. Again, the base is really behind Donald Trump, and the polling is very evident in this. So, you know, the DeSantis campaign really needs a miracle, I think. And they do have a good ground game in Iowa. They have put a ton of resources in Iowa. But again, they're putting all their eggs in that one basket. So if DeSantis is going to win the primary, he would need a shocking victory in Iowa to sort of propel him. And again, the problem with that is you don't have enough time to then send your guys to New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina, and get the polls up there because, you know, DeSantis is down in those states by 30, 40 points. So even if he does miraculously win Iowa, and Iowa's admittedly one of his better polling states, he still has to push uphill in those other states. So it's incredibly difficult to do that. It's certainly an unenviable task. And I think for many Republicans, you know, the Glenn Youngkins of the party, they're really sitting this one out, and I think that's a smart idea. I definitely wouldn't recommend somebody like Youngkin, somebody who's incredibly talented, would be a force to reckon with on the national stage. I wouldn't even recommend him getting into this race or any other Republican. You might as well let DeSantis fight it out with Trump. Again, it's a long shot. You know, at this point, obviously it looks like he's going to lose that fight, and Donald Trump's going to go on to the general election and likely lose there as well. So, again, things are not going well in the DeSantis campaign. There's a few months, obviously. Things can change. But as things are going and as they have been going, Ron DeSantis is on track to place a distant second in the Republican primary. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Comment them down below. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, subscribe already. Like this video down below. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.